The wind howled through the trees as Mark closed the door to his small cabin in the woods. Just another quiet evening. Or so he thought. A faint scratching came from outside. Curious, he opened the door slightly and froze. Standing in the shadows was a German shepherd, eyes hollow, body trembling, with a long scar running down its side. The dog limped forward, slowly, painfully, like a ghost from a distant past. Mark's heart pounded. It couldn't be. "Ranger," he whispered, his voice cracking. The dog stopped, ears twitching. No, this was impossible. Ranger had died in the war, buried under rubble after an explosion in Kandahar. That was 5 years ago. But those eyes, that scar, that familiar tilt of the head. Mark staggered back, overwhelmed. Could this truly be the loyal war dog he had mourned for years? Or was this some cruel twist of fate? Mark had been just 25 when he was deployed overseas. He wasn't new to discipline or danger, but nothing could prepare him for the harsh, burning sands of Kandahar or the constant uncertainty of who might be friend or foe. It was during his second month of deployment that he was assigned a partner. Not another soldier, but a German shepherd named Ranger. From the start, Ranger was unlike any other military dog Mark had seen. He was alert, highly trained, and fiercely loyal. But more than that, there was something almost human in the way Ranger looked at him. Like he understood every unspoken word, every emotion hidden behind Mark's stoic face. They trained together, slept side by side in tents, and carried out countless patrols. In the chaos of war, they became each other's anchor. Ranger wasn't just sniffing out bombs or warning of ambushes. He was keeping Mark alive and sane. On nights when gunfire echoed in the distance, Ranger would press his body close to Mark's, eyes scanning the dark. He never slept fully, not until he was sure Mark was safe. There was one mission in particular that cemented their bond forever. A roadside bomb had gone off just minutes after they passed by, and Mark had been thrown into a ditch, dazed and bleeding. Enemies were closing in, but Ranger stayed. Instead of running, he stood his ground, growling and barking furiously. He took a bullet to the shoulder protecting Mark that day, but he never left his side. Mark carried him back to base, swearing he would never let harm come to his brave companion again. Their unit called them the Unbreakable Duo. Ranger was more than a dog. He was a brother in arms, a friend in a place where friendships were rare and precious. But war doesn't promise happy endings. On what was supposed to be their final mission together, their convoy was ambushed. The explosion came from nowhere 1 second. They were joking the back of a vehicle. The next, Mark was thrown onto ground, ears ringing, dust choking his lungs. When he woke, he was told Ranger hadn't made it. The dog had run toward the blast to protect the unit and had been buried under the rubble. They searched for hours but found nothing but broken gear and scorched ground. Mark refused to believe it at first. He called for him until his voice cracked, dug through the dirt with bleeding hands. But there was no sign. Eventually, even Mark had to accept the truth. His best friend was gone. He returned home weeks later, decorated for bravery, but hollow inside. The battlefield was behind him, but he left a part of himself behind. Ranger wasn't just a casualty of war. He was a part of Mark that believed in loyalty without question, love without limits. He never expected to feel that again, until the scratching at his door. The mission briefing had felt like any other. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a dull orange glow across the barren terrain. Mark and Ranger sat silently in the back of the Humvee, surrounded by fellow soldiers, their nerves calm but focused. It was supposed to be routine, a quick sweep through an abandoned village suspected of hiding IEDs. But nothing in war ever goes as planned. As the convoy rolled into the narrow dirt path surrounded by crumbling mud buildings, Ranger became restless. His ears perked up and nose twitching. Mark immediately noticed the change. Ranger never acted without reason. "Something's off," Mark whispered into his radio. The vehicle stopped. The unit dismounted, eyes scanning every rooftop, every alley. Ranger pulled hard on his leash, guiding Mark toward a particular building. That's when everything exploded. A deafening boom rocked the earth. Mark was thrown backward, his helmet flying off, and a wave of heat singed his face. Dust filled the air, blinding and choking. For a moment, everything went silent, except for a sharp ringing in his ears. He couldn't see, couldn't breathe, couldn't think. Then came the screaming. Gunfire erupted. Chaos. But Mark wasn't focused on the attack. He was focused on one thing. Ranger. The last thing he saw before the explosion was Ranger breaking free, running toward the building where the IED had likely been triggered. Had he gone in to warn them? To stop it? To save someone? Mark scrambled through the smoke and rubble, calling out, "Ranger! Ranger!" There was no answer. As reinforcement arrived and the area was secured, Mark refused to leave. He dug with his bare hands, tossing aside debris, coughing up dirt. His fellow soldiers tried to pull him away, but he kept digging. They found a piece of a torn harness, some blood, a scorched dog tag. That was it. Command classified Ranger as Kia, killed in action. A military funeral was held, but there was no body to bury. Mark stood at the empty grave with tears in his eyes and a weight on his chest he couldn't explain. They never found him, he kept saying. That means he could still be out there. But no one believed him. Not really. When he returned home, he carried the guilt and the unanswered questions. Could he have done more? Why did Ranger run toward the blast? Did he survive for a moment? Was he scared? Did he look for Mark? He replayed that day in his mind hundreds of times over the years, especially on the quiet nights when everything else faded. But nothing ever changed. Ranger was gone. Until now, because the dog at his door had the same eyes, the same scar on the shoulder, the exact place he'd been shot during that mission so long ago. Mark's hands trembled. Was it possible Ranger had survived? If so, where had he been all these years? And how had he found his way home? After the war, Mark returned to a life that felt foreign. The bustling streets, the laughter of strangers, even the smell of fresh rain. It all seemed distant. Everything reminded him of the time he had spent overseas. But nothing haunted him more than the absence of Ranger. He kept Ranger's collar hanging near the door next to his old army coat. Some nights, he would sit with a glass of whiskey, running his fingers over the metal tag, reading the worn-out engraving. Ranger, always alert. Time passed, but the emptiness remained. People said he should move on, start fresh, maybe get another dog. But how do you replace a soul you went through hell with? Mark tried to distract himself. He moved to a small cabin deep in the woods, far from the noise of the city. He took up carpentry, spending hours chiseling wood just to keep his hands busy and his mind from slipping into the past. But memories are not easily buried. Sometimes, in the middle of the night, he'd wake up in a cold sweat, convinced he heard barking. Other times, he swore he saw a shadow moving near the tree line. Each time, he'd step outside, heart pounding, whispering Ranger's name into the dark. No one came. On Ranger's birthday each year, Mark would leave out a bowl of food on the porch. A ritual, he told himself. A sign of respect. A part of him believed, hoped, Ranger might somehow still be out there, alive. He read stories of dogs traveling miles to return to their owners. He watched rescue videos late at night. Once, he even reached out to an animal tracker, sharing the scar pattern and description of his dog. But nothing ever came of it. People thought he was delusional. But Mark knew that bond, that connection, wasn't something that could vanish in smoke and rubble. He often asked himself, what if Ranger had survived that explosion, confused and wounded? What if he was captured or taken in by locals, or worse, used in ways Mark didn't want to imagine? The guilt of not finding him burned deeply. It was the one chapter in his life that never found closure. Still, he endured, until the night he heard scratching at his door. A sound so faint he thought he imagined it. But when he opened that door and saw the dog, scarred, exhausted, eyes full of pain and recognition, his world cracked open. Could it really be him? Mark crouched, afraid to move too fast, afraid it would all vanish like a dream. Ranger, is that really you? The dog took a step forward, then another, and when it gently pressed his head against Mark's chest, whimpering ever so softly, he knew Ranger had returned from the shadows. Mark's heart raced as he knelt in front of the dog, unsure whether he was dreaming or if this was truly happening. The figure in front of him, its familiar eyes, the scar on its shoulder, the way it stood, could only be one dog. Ranger? Mark whispered again, this time his voice trembling, as if afraid to break the fragile moment. The dog lifted its head, sniffed the air, and then slowly, painfully limped forward. Mark's breath caught as the dog's weary body collapsed against his chest. It was a quiet gesture, one that said more than words ever could. It was the same bond they had shared in the war, the same love, the same loyalty. Mark reached down, trembling, and stroked the dog's matted fur. He could feel the scars, the rough patches where the fur had been worn down, and the harshness of its body. The years had clearly not been kind to Ranger, and yet, in that moment, Mark could feel the familiar warmth radiating from the dog. "How did you get here?" Mark murmured, brushing his hand through Ranger's fur. His mind spun with questions, but one in particular stood out. Where has he been all these years? Ranger didn't answer. Of course he couldn't. But as Mark ran his hands down his body, checking for injuries, it was clear the dog had suffered. His ribs were visible, his coat was thin, and there were patches of dried blood along his legs. It wasn't just the scars that told the story. It was the exhaustion in Ranger's eyes, the kind of weariness Mark had seen in soldiers returning from the battlefield, the kind that never truly healed. Mark gently guided Ranger into the cabin, his legs shaking from the overwhelming mix of emotions. The door clicked shut behind them, sealing them in a space where time seemed to stand still. He let the dog rest on the couch while he scrambled to find food, water, and anything that could comfort his old friend. The reality of the situation hadn't fully hit him yet. He was still processing the shock of seeing Ranger alive after all these years. As Mark went about gathering supplies, his mind kept racing. What could have happened to Ranger during these years? Had he been wandering, alone, through the wilds of war-torn regions? Had he been captured and somehow managed to escape? The possibilities were endless, and each one made Mark's heart ache more than the last. But at that moment, the past didn't matter. The only thing that mattered was the present. Ranger was home. Mark sat down beside the dog, the two of them in silence. It felt surreal, but there was something healing in this quiet reunion. The dog was no longer the war hero, the soldier's companion. He was simply Ranger, the dog who would return home against all odds. Mark whispered once more, a final time, to the dog that had shared his heart and soul. "You came back. I never stop hoping." And as if in response, Ranger's tail gave a faint, exhausted wag. It wasn't much, but it was everything. The night was quiet, save for the occasional sound of wind rustling through the trees outside. Mark sat next to Ranger, both of them now resting in the cabin. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, the warmth a stark contrast to the chill that had settled in the air. Mark glanced over at Ranger, who was lying with his head resting on his paws, eyes still alert but weary. The dog's breathing was slow and steady now, but every so often a low whimper would escape his lips. It was a sound Mark knew too well from the battlefield, both the sound of pain and the sound of a soldier trying to hold on. Mark couldn't help but trace the scar along Ranger's side. The deep wound was something only a true survivor would carry. It was a reminder of the explosion that had nearly taken Ranger's life all those years ago. The same scar that had once been a symbol of the brutality of war was now a sign of the dog's resilience. As he ran his fingers gently over the scar, memories from that day flooded Mark's mind. He remembered how Ranger had charged toward the blast, his instinct to protect his comrades and his handler more powerful than any fear. Ranger had saved lives that day, including Mark's, but in doing so, he had been wounded. When the explosion had hit, Ranger had shielded Mark from some of the blast, taking the full force of the impact himself. Mark had always believed that Ranger had died on the battlefield. The grief of losing his partner had weighed heavily on him. Yet now, as he sat next to the dog who had endured so much, Mark realized something remarkable. The bond they shared had never been broken. Despite the years of separation, despite the pain and the distance, Ranger had found his way home. Mark could hardly believe it. How had Ranger survived all this time? Had he been wandering alone, surviving on instinct? Had someone else taken care of him? Or had he been searching for Mark, just as Mark had always hoped? It didn't matter. What mattered was that Ranger had returned, The dog's presence was a healing force, one that reminded Mark that love, loyalty, and friendship could transcend even the most unimaginable circumstances. For hours, Mark sat by the fire, reflecting on the years he had spent without Ranger, on the loneliness that had consumed him after the war. But in this moment, the emptiness that had once haunted him seemed to fade away. He wasn't alone anymore. Ranger's tail gave a small, tired wag, and Mark smiled, a tear slipping down his cheek. He leaned down and gently whispered into the dog's ear, "You're home now, buddy. You're home." And just like that, the years of pain, the uncertainty, the fear, they all melted away. In this small, quiet cabin, Mark and Ranger had found each other again. And though the scars of the past would never truly disappear, they had won another. Together, they were finally whole.